There's going to be an emerging nexus around US markets, US tech, US finance, US stablecoins on one side, or you can work with Iran on the other. It's up to you. Now, we all know which countries are going to be targeted by that. It's a short list, and some of them are very large countries. But we're aware of what that binary means. So that's then looming as a larger scale issue, which is really potentially going to pull the rug out from underneath a lot of people.
Welcome to Thoughtful Money. I'm Thoughtful Money founder and your host, Adam Taggart. And today we've got the very great pleasure and good fortune to be sitting down in discussion with the one and only Michael Every, Mr. Mercantilism himself. There's a lot going on in the world about the things that Michael had been predicting for well over a decade, has been proven totally right in spades about it all. And now I can think of really nobody better to kind of give us an audible real-time call on what exactly is going on right now. And Michael, there's a lot of things I want to talk about with you specifically. Iran, some of the recent actions in the US, all sorts of geopolitical developments. But I think your interest is more in talking about all of this at the 30,000 foot level and trying to take all these disparate pieces of what's going on in the world and try to unify them into kind of a master outlook over it all. And I would love nothing more to hear that too. And I think our readers, our viewers would be really interested in that. So is it okay if we start there?
Please, that would give me great pleasure.
Okay. We will do that. Just a quick apology. Michael has been kind enough to sit down first thing his morning over there in Asia to have this conversation with us. So it's late my time or later my time than I normally record. You're getting me straight from the gym, Michael. So if my hair looks extra disheveled, that's why, and I apologize. But with that out of the way, let's, I'd ask you what things have your attention most right now, and you feel free to start there if you like. But however we can most expeditiously get to your unification at the 30,000 foot level, let's get there as fast as we can.
Sure. Okay. So let me then try and summarize this. I'm sure everyone watching is fully cognizant of the fact that US Treasury Secretary Bessent has recently introduced what he himself is describing as a Treasury version of Operation Twist, where he's increasing buybacks, relatively small scale, but symbolically very significant, of off-the-run, longer duration US bonds, which are going to be funded by the issuance of more T-bills. I presume everyone's completely on board with that because it moved markets a lot at the time.
I think so. One quick question for you. I agree. This feels and looks very much like a Treasury Operation Twist. You would put that under the umbrella of yield curve control, correct?
Not 100%. It's moving in that direction. This is still technically shifting of maturities to the shorter end of the curve, which, by the way, of course, is what we saw under Yellen previously at Treasury, and of course, is what you see in many emerging markets who can't manage their debt profile. So that in itself is significant with those two parallels. And I'm sure you'll have a long line of other guests who can talk about that in more granularity than I can, being based in the US and possibly even trading those markets directly. But what I want to add is that when you look at what is happening around the world at the same time, you can see that I think it's not Operation Twist, it's Special Military Operation Twist. Because let me talk you through it. First of all, the day before Bessent did that, he put out a public offering or a suggestion for public input on the Genius Act, which is linked to stablecoins, of course. And we know that the Clarity Act, to really bookend that piece of legislation, is still imminent. We don't know exactly when that will happen, but it looks like it's going to be before the end of the year, which means that you can probably expect stablecoins to be pushing out aggressively by 2027 at the latest. Now, this is all going to tie together, stick with me,
Yeah.
but what do we know about stablecoins? Well, several things, but the most pertinent to what I've just said is that they will, if they are adopted en masse around the world, which I expect them to be in emerging markets in
Hmm.
particular, you are going to see people buying them, and therefore stablecoin issuers will need to buy treasury bills.
Right.
So, in other words, we're going to shift US issuance to the short end of the curve, just as we're going to create an artificial bump for several $trillion worth potentially, which, to be frank, isn't that big in terms of the US deficits that keep being run, but temporarily at least is going to make sure that you don't get too much upward pressure at the short end there. Now, what that means for the Fed is a whole separate issue. Let's just
Yeah.
consider the Treasury in isolation there. Okay, so first of all, that's already hanging around in the background. I don't see too many people making that link between what just happened here and the stablecoin thing. Stablecoins are also absolutely, if they do roll out on scale, going to be with us or against us, George Bush style or George W. Bush style, basically saying, are you going to be in the US monetary camp with these new assets, even though they're actually not currency, they're a digital IOU backed by US debt held in the US? Or are you going to reject them? At which point, maybe we're going to limit market access. So you
Yeah.
start to bifurcate the world. That's inherently geopolitical. So that's happening on one side of the screen, and not everyone's linking to it. On the other, we have had the US now say, again, led by Bessent after the Trump tweet, that it's total economic war against Iran.
Hmm.
Now, you and I,
And again, to your point, it's a lot
yeah,
like your stablecoin positioning, where it's we're putting maximum economic pressure on Iran, but we are also pressuring the other countries of the world out there, saying if you continue to do business with Iran, you're going to get slapped by us.
absolutely. There's going to be an emerging nexus around US markets, US tech, US finance, US stablecoins on one side, or you can work with Iran on the other. It's up to you. Now, we all know which countries are going to be targeted by that. It's a short list, and some of them are very large countries. But we're aware of what that binary means. So that's then looming as a larger scale issue, which is really potentially going to pull the rug out from underneath a lot of people. But in the interim, let's consider this too, that I have seen regular commentary from people who are loosely connecting what's been happening in Iran with financial markets, saying, have you noticed every time the US 10-year gets to a certain threshold, Trump comes out and says there's a deal looming?
Right.
Now, I think that's been true to a degree, but if you're going to be moving issuance down the curve and effectively, in brackets, doing yield curve control to an extent without doing it openly, but making it very clear that the pattern is to control the curve one way or another, then you are effectively saying we are not going to allow the financial market constraints of the treasury market to tell us what we do or don't do militarily against Iran.
Mhm.
So I think for now we stick with the economic warfare and we see how hard Iran can be squeezed. And it is being squeezed much harder now. There is apparently no oil getting out, so there's no revenue for them
No
whatsoever.
Iranian oil getting out.
No Iranian oil, no
There
Iranian oil to
there are
clarify.
reports that there's actually a fair amount of oil. I just saw 10 million barrels, I think, a day that is sort of sneaking out the Oman route via U.S. Chaperone fleets and stuff. I don't know if that's exactly true, but it does seem that oil prices seem to suggest there's some supply getting out because if zero were, I think oil prices would be higher than they are right now.
I think you're right. It's very, very open to debate, and I know a lot of experts who see it in different ways.
Sure.
But it's certainly there as a ballpark figure because you have to say that the one institution that would know better than anyone what's going on would be the US Navy if they're there on the
Hmm.
ground rather than just looking from satellites. So Iran's being squeezed in terms of revenue. Now it's going to be squeezed in terms of everyone else trading with it. That means they can't pay their own soldiers. They can't pay their own militia. So you can, and the inflation, I think, is, I lose track of how high it is.
I think it's
It's
approaching
staggering.
100%. Yeah, I think it's now
Uh,
above the 80s. It was at 50 at the start of the war.
Absolutely, and the currency is collapsing. So there is real economic pressure. Now, Iran will go to a survival economy. Don't get me wrong. I expected that from the beginning. But over time, depending on how long this can be extended for, you could see that really working. But not only that, as I've discussed with you before, I believe in our last chat, and certainly maybe the one before that, I think that the US will have to return to military action versus Iran, but after the midterms. So
Hmm.
therefore, you have a couple of months of really, really weakening them, undermining that regime where people aren't even being paid to be out there in uniform doing what Iran's telling them to do, while they can't afford to put chicken on the table, etc. Um, and at the same time, you are removing the constraint which says the market's telling me I can't do this
Right.
geopolitically. And you are actually, with stable coins, making it cheaper to do it, whilst at the same time reinforcing the mechanism which makes countries either get with you or against you. So that's what I'm talking about in terms of how to look at the totality. But
Right.
that's only Iran. It's not even the broader Middle East, and it's not even the broader world.
Yeah. So a couple of things. So what you're describing here is mercantilism to a large extent, right? I mean, it's the state putting its thumb on different parts of the economy, saying, I've got a national security interest that trumps your free market, your ability to just live in the free markets, and therefore, we're gonna really feed stable coins, or we're really gonna push economically hard here, even if that starves from other parts of the economy. And this is something that you have predicted for a super long time, but the playbook, I get the sense you're not surprised by any of these tactics. Not saying you agree with them, but they all, to me at least, seem to fit naturally in under a mercantilist regime. Am I seeing it right?
Yes, the only clarification, to be a real
Sure.
boring,
No,
nerdy
please.
purist, is that I would use the framework of economic statecraft, because I think that describes what we're seeing as in using every instrument of state together towards an economic goal. Mercantilism is, of course, and again, super, super nerdy. Mercantilism is when you're trying to deliberately run a trade surplus to stockpile gold, which I think some people would like to go back to. Absolutely.
Sure.
And neo-mercantilism is when you use the state as much as possible with the private sector to try and run a trade surplus just to have more physical production of stuff. So I think the America is moving towards neo-mercantilism rather than mercantilism because they're not going for gold here.
Okay.
But we're not there yet because you still have a large trade deficit. So it would be a little bit of a misrepresentation to say a country with such a large deficit is running that policy, but it's using economic statecraft, which is the thought process of saying this is how we pull different levers in ways we never normally do. And they are definitely aiming at neo-mercantilism. They would like to try and close that trade deficit where possible.
Okay, I appreciate the clarity there. Um, but economic statecraft, especially the way it's being used right now, you tend to see much more of it under a mercantilist or neo-mercantilist government than you would a globalist government, pro-globalization government, correct?
Yeah, yes. I mean, to be blunt, you still get economic statecraft under a globalist government, but it can be very self-harming. I mean, I'm not saying that neo-mercantilism can't be if it's done
Hmm.
wrong or if it's done in a way that you personally object to. You would see that as self-harming. But if you look at how the US built the global architecture that it's now dismantling, let's not spend too long on this. The US used a lot of economic statecraft in order to achieve the open world goals that it's now retreating from, which was, as I said, inevitable it would do that. But it used a lot of policy levers in ways that were not particularly friendly, shall we say, in, real classic men in suits and earpieces and black sunglasses kind of
Yeah.
fashion to build the world as was. So, yes, everyone can use it. It's now being used much more towards neo-mercantilism, I agree.
Okay. All right. That's very helpful clarification. Thank you. Um, I want to ask, I know you've got much more to say, but I just want to ask for some clarity on a few things you've mentioned here. Um, so while you, I think, probably correctly made the distinction that Operation Twist isn't necessarily yield curve control, its intent is to flatten the yield curve. So it's kind of spiritually aligned with yield curve control. You talk about stable coins. again, their intent, right, is to get a lot of demand from the rest of the world buying treasuries. That demand should raise treasury prices, lower yields again. So in effect, that's kind of part of a yield curve control playbook as well. So even though maybe it's not textbook definition of yield curve control, these things are still spiritually aligned with it, correct?
They are, but in the same way that a knife can be used to peel a piece of fruit, or to defend your home from an intruder,
Hmm.
that tool has very, very different uses depending on the situation. And here, I would be gobsmacked. I think this really is an important point to stress. If Bessent is doing this just to flatten the yield curve and doesn't have a thought beyond that, and they're issuing stable coins just to try and get more people buying treasuries or T-bills in this particular instance,
Hmm.
and there is no planning strategically beyond that, no second, no third, no fourth order effects, well, I'm in the wrong job. This should be our last chat, because I have nothing of value to add. I'm just a fantasist. But I would wager strongly, given what they say, that no, there is a comprehensive plan to reindustrialize, reshore, if necessary, bifurcate the world into those who are with us and those
Yeah.
who are against us, and to have a plan where the US economy is more Hamiltonian in its original sense after
Hmm.
independence, and more directed, where the government incentivizes and encourages and cajoles and threatens the private sector into doing things that increase US power rather than quarterly returns for all and sundry, regardless of what they're doing.
Hmm.
And I think you would neutrally agree with me that that's exactly what we see happening.
I mean, I can't really think of why anybody could argue with what you did just laid out there. So you get basically the takeaway from you is think of these things right now as sort of opening salvos to a much larger grand strategy.
Well, it's an unfolding and evolving grand strategy because, for example, just very briefly, without diving back into this too much necessarily, the US had expected to win versus Iran quickly, like it did versus Venezuela. I don't think there's any question that's what they thought would happen.
Right? Yeah.
That hasn't happened. It's exposed significant and real weaknesses in the US economy, in US preparations, in the US Pentagon, for example. Like, why were there no drone defenses in the Middle East, against
Right.
Iranian attack? It's a staggering, staggering complacency, which shows
Right.
that all large bureaucracies, even when you've got their leadership talking rah 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 about this new great game, they're always behind the curve. They're always fighting the last war,
The
literally.
last war, literally. Yeah.
Yeah. So now things will have to adapt quickly. But I think what we are seeing here is the US continuing to recognize that whether it's through building things or whether it's through tearing them down, literally or architecturally, it can still leverage the situation it finds itself in as the legacy hegemon to its advantage. So it's not where it wanted to be, but that doesn't mean it's absolutely out in the cold. Now, there's one area to segue to very quickly that I would be remiss not to mention, which is the energy sector.
Hmm.
That even if we are getting 10 million barrels a day through Hormuz, and let's presume we are, for the sake of argument,
Hmm.
that's half what we used to get. But then we look at the fact that China is buying much less, which it is. And we look at the fact that Saudi Arabia is managing to get, say, maybe five, six, seven out via the Red Sea, et cetera, et cetera. Things aren't as urgent as they looked up until recently. So maybe
Hmm.
that US tactic is working. But what we are still short of is refined product, diesel, rather than
Hmm.
crude.
Yeah.
So you see that in the US economy right now. And this is where multi layered thinking, rather than saying energy dominance in terms of crude or gas, solves your problems. You need every kind of distillate in order to have that fully functioning machine. So we are short of the refineries in the Middle East. And that's going to be a real issue. Now, I'm going to open the door here rather than walking through it, but I have made the joke with you before, or the pun, which is serious in intent, even if it's very loose in detail or sketchy in detail, which is if we continue to go down this route, the economic statecraft and economic warfare versus Iran works, we move towards an acceleration in military activity and maybe far more aggressive military activity this time,
Mm-hmm.
rather than we won't touch this, we won't touch that.
Because we
And
feel
that's
more
not
empowered by the success. Yeah.
yes, indeed. Then maybe this can all be resolved easily in terms of diesel over a few months. If not, I think we will have to see far more aggressive economic statecraft for the US to say, we are going to get diesel in adequate supply, and we are
Mm-hmm.
going to have it at prices which are suitable for the US economy, even if that means other people don't get it. Because rather than rationing by price, which is how a market economy works globally, it will be rationing by shut up and give me the stuff.
Yeah. Rationing by
And
supply. Yeah.
yeah,
We're gonna keep most of it because it's the domestic priority. The rest of you guys sucks to be you.
exactly. So I'm not saying we're there yet, but we head in that direction. And if the US therefore suffers because other people say, well, we're not going to be selling to you if you don't sell to us, you have to create a nexus whereby you can guarantee that you will make sure that you, in that closed loop, have enough of everything you need. And that, I think, is still looming, on the horizon. Once you recognize that you can play with the treasury market, and you can play with sanctions, and you can play with the US dollar via stable coins, nothing is sacrosanct. Anything and everything can be thrown into the mix.
Yeah. No, that's super interesting. And I don't want to get into this for too long because I'm not an energy expert, but if there was a reduction in supply coming out of the Persian Gulf, which there is, um, we have refineries, right? And they're able to refine, funnily enough, domestically we have a big supply of light sweet crude, um, but we also have the refineries for the much thicker stuff, the more dirtier stuff. And when you kind of look at it, since we're trying to look from a 30,000 foot level, maybe that does make sense why we went after Venezuela first, right? Because we are increasing our supply to our refineries from either oil we buy from Venezuela or we help them sell and we keep a portion of it. Um, so, maybe that was 3D chess in advance of all this, of saying, hey, if we might potentially crimp world supply because things in the strait go sideways, at least we've got this new source of supply that we can then make diesel out of. So, I know right now diesel is in short supply. I have no idea how quickly the free market can react to that, but it will need supply to react to it. And again, Venezuela is a new source of supply that we just coincidentally, who knows, managed to put in place this year.
Well, I agree. That's one of the reasons why I thought the Venezuela action would happen the way it did. I believe, and these are very rough figures, but I've heard that the US is now taking around half of Venezuela's production, whereas previously, almost all of it went to China. So that's a
Yeah.
significant pivot.
And just to
Unfortunately,
be
it's
clear,
nowhere
when you
near
say
enough.
take, we're buying it from them. It's not like we're just basically absconding with it, correct?
Yes, I'm not claiming that you're extracting it as imperial tribute. You're buying it,
Yeah.
um, but they clearly need to ramp it up. Unfortunately, many of the things that are happening are going to happen slowly. Like the US needs new refineries. That's a slow process. The
Hmm.
US needs to get Venezuela to get back up to where it was, 10, 15, 20 years ago, where it's 2 or 3 million barrels a day, rather than 500,000. So it needs to get them back up there. Um, all these are complicated and difficult things to do. Everything the US is doing is complicated and difficult to do and will take time. And the real physical world constraints, to link back to what I was just saying a moment ago, they matter far more than the financial constraints.
Correct.
So again,
Yeah.
people pulling their hair out and saying, oh my God, you're playing with the treasury market. Have you seen how many peripheral government bonds the ECB has bought? For example, Italian government bonds, peripheral government bonds. The European bond market or bond markets, the spreads between them, they have an overt policy. If the spread gets too wide between country X and country Y, we just buy country Y. No
Hmm.
one turns around and says, well, that's the end, that's disaster, that's doom. The Bank of Japan, obviously, in extremis, has been buying JGBs left, right, and center, in some points, almost all the issuance for years. The country is still standing. All of them and the US together face these physical constraints now. So, and I've made this joke with you before, I'll repeat it because it's one I like. The US is using financial fartcraft, as in, but speculative bubbles of gas, to try and prepare for a world of warcraft. You have to use this economic statecraft of financial mechanisms and adjustment to the curve, stable coins, etc., towards getting physical supply, either within the US economy or from others. So that's the game. And I'm 100% sure Bessent gets that
Yeah,
and is working towards that goal.
that's interesting. I was going to say, no matter what financial gimmickry you can come up with, it's not going to result in an extra barrel of oil coming out of the ground. And I still think that's true, but you have made a good distinction, which is it can be used as a lever to persuade, cajole an ally into selling you more supply. So in a secondary effect, maybe it can actually help you get more oil. Although it's not more oil coming out of the ground, it's just you're using it to get a bigger part of the pie that already exists.
Yeah, but it does mean, to shift the metaphor, that the blanket is going to be too small and some people are going to get cold feet in that particular world. And that will actually be amplified by what they've done with the treasury curve, because you are already seeing logically people saying, hey, look, if we're going to be running this hot, which we are, if we're going to be keeping borrowing costs down so everyone can continue to pile into AI, for example, to pile into this sector, into that sector, of course, that's going to have an upward pressure on commodity prices because there is only so much physical
Hmm.
stuff out there at any given time. So, ironically, you create even more physical pressure with that financial uh, lubrication, if you will. But that just means you have to have stuff lined up. If you don't, then you really are starting to go the route that many people rather simplistically think the US is already going, which is, well, we're just printing money, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and it'll all end in catastrophe. Yeah, if you don't have a detailed, planned ahead, physical plan for the US economy to match the financial, that is what will transpire. But I think that's what used to be the case. So when the Fed, as was doing Operation Twist, when the Fed was doing QE on a massive scale, do you think for a moment they were thinking about the physical economy? Do you think for a second they were thinking about supply chains or US
Mm.
industry? I put it to you, they were not, sir.
Yes. All right. Very good point. Well made. And Michael, just to give you a reminder here, I am working up when we get to concluding this conversation, to putting the unfair question I give to you every time we talk, knowing that you don't give out financial recommendations, but I will ask, are there general investing themes that come out of your worldview? And sounds like one of them, which I'm pretty sure had already been there before, was commodities should actually do pretty well on this type of, on a relative basis, in this type of era for exactly the reasons that you just mentioned. But I'll give you a chance to expound on that or correct me in any way when we get near the end of the discussion here. This is a little wonky, but I feel the need to ask it because I think it's an important question, and then we'll get back to anything else in your 30,000-foot view you want to share. Back to stablecoins. Let's assume that they are effective in the way that you think the administration hopes they're going to be effective, right? You get this new and large buyer of treasury debt out there that wasn't there before. Um, I mean, I think in a lot of ways you could say, wow, that's probably actually really preferable versus like having the Fed come in and monetize treasury debt, right? All these stable coins getting bought, as you said earlier, they're not monetary instruments. So you're not increasing the money supply. You theoretically shouldn't get inflation from them. And so, yeah, if this is a way to, make the world more dependent on US dollar denominated assets, and it's non-inflationary, I mean, why would you not do it if you could get away with it?
Well, yes, and let me add a few more thoughts to that. I've heard some really interesting arguments around stablecoins. Uh, to be blunt, most of the conversation is still around, how do you make money from it? And I look, I understand that, and that's not what I do, right?
Yeah.
But I think
I think
people
the
who
answer to
really
that question is you become a stablecoin issuer and you get to keep the bond interest, which right now they're not allowed to pass on to stablecoin holders. So like what is it? No, I'm having a brain freeze. But the main one,
the Genius Act.
yeah, no, the stablecoin issuer
Oh,
themselves.
Tether, Circle.
Uh, yeah, maybe Circle. There's one other one that I'm thinking of, and I'm just it's like the biggest one. It's not coming to my brain. But basically, they're like one of the biggest buyers of gold and gold miners. They're actually even buying gold mines at this point because they have this corporate treasury that just keeps growing because they're getting all of the interest income off of their increasingly large treasury portfolio. So it's that to me seems to be if you're lucky enough to get the gig, if you become a large stablecoin issuer, that's probably a great way to get rich. Other than that, I'm with you. Like, I don't really know how you make money off of this stuff. Now, there might be strategic reasons for you to still own it, but I don't see them as like a get rich quick type of, crypto like Bitcoin was or Ethereum has been. So I'm with you, is what I'm saying.
Sure. Where the advantage lies is more for the US Inc., I believe, because it's not just about cementing the role of the dollar, which obviously is still primary, but people are chipping away at more and more, at least in terms of the financial market op-ed pages, and understandably to a degree, even if they'll maybe look at everything that's wrong with the dollar, but then not look at everyone else. So they're only
Mhm.
looking at one dirty shirt and not genuinely actually holding up the others and seeing how dirty they are, right?
Yeah.
Which is it's true. It is a dirty shirt, but yeah, go look at all the others and then compare. But here's where I think it could get interesting, and I've hypothesized on this for a while. I don't think we've discussed it. The first one is this: that interest rate spread you were just discussing. I imagine, and I think the Clarity Act is the piece of legislation that's going to cement this one way or the other, is going to be passed on to the end user. So some of it will be kept by the issuer, but I think a lot of it will disappear. And where you can get an advantage in doing that is, imagine you have a flood of trillions of dollars of capital coming into the US, all buying T-bills. What's that going to do to the T-bill rate?
Oh, to bring the rate down, right? Ton of
Right.
capital coming
Okay.
in, buying, pushing up
Okay.
prices. Yeah.
Right. So the US gets lower interest rates, which is only useful if it's going into useful parts of the economy. That's my question. What is GDP for? If it's going to inflate assets, that's useless. That's old-fashioned Fed thinking. Financial market 101 doesn't help you with economic statecraft. But so you've got that happening. That's a tool that can be used if you use it the right way. Two things then happen in conjunction. Offshore, if you expand the supply of stable coins just enough, but you stay slightly behind where you see demand being. Now, the private sector will be doing it, so it'll be hard to calibrate. But I
Hmm.
guess T-bill issuance itself can drive that to an extent. Rather than the capital inflow saying we have to issue this many T-bills, you can strategically decide how many T-bills you issue, which therefore, of course, limits how many stable coins you can issue because you can't issue them without it if you're backing them by T-bills. You can theoretically have a much higher US dollar interest rate abroad than you do at home because the demand will be for them such
Yep.
that people will be bidding them up, trying to get them, right?
Correct. Yep.
So you can have a split in the global interest rate where the dollar is propped up internationally, no matter how wobbly it looks on some metrics, by paying X, and domestically within the US, just for a dollar, not a US dollar stable coin, but a dollar, it can be lower. If you then make dollars more and more difficult to access abroad, because, for example, you start saying, we're going to pay for imports in dollar stable coins, or we're going to lean on major energy exporters like Saudi Arabia to say, when we export energy to everyone who needs it, we want to be paid in dollar stable coins.
Yeah. It's no longer the
You are
petrodollar. It's the petro stablecoin. Yeah.
exactly. You suddenly create all this demand. And from a balance sheet perspective, and this is maybe a little bit too technical, I would imagine you'll get a furrowed brow when I say this. Most of my economic colleagues get a furrowed brow. They can't work out how it works. And it took me a hell of a long time sketching it down, kind of Rube Goldberg style,
Rube
trying to
Goldberg
write it on a
style.
piece of paper. Um, Technically, if you pay for imports with dollar stable coins, it doesn't even operate on the current account capital account the same way that it does under the current metrics.
Okay.
Because the UST bill stays within the US entity. It's held by a stablecoin issuer within the US. Now, you could say that treasury bills and treasury bonds are still technically maybe held by the Fed, even if they're claimed by other central banks. But here, they're definitely kept within the US. But no dollars leave the US to pay for the goods.
Yeah.
You get a
Yeah. No.
digital token. There you
Yep.
go. There's a shiny digital token which tells you that I've expanded my T-bill supply domestically, which, by the way, the government still has there in the US. And
Right.
here's a shiny token rather than a dollar. So effectively, let's go back to that neo-mercantilism argument. Well, you're paying for your imports, but you're not actually paying for them anymore. Not directly. That changes the whole balance sheet dynamic. And again, people struggle to get their head around it because all the spreadsheets aren't set up like this.
Yeah.
None of the balance sheets work.
My brow's only semi-furrowed on this, but I totally get what you're saying, and I think this is correct, which is stable coins do not increase the liability of
Yeah,
America, the side of the balance
correct.
sheet. Yeah.
Correct.
We,
But
we,
you get
we
a
have those
physical good
treasury
asset.
bonds. We have that liability, but that's it. Doesn't matter how many stable coins people buy, as long as we don't have to increase the supply of treasuries as a result of that. Um, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a good gig if you can get it.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's not perfect. There are always yes buts. There are always workarounds. There are a lot of very clever people who will immediately try and find workarounds to it. But the principle is pretty clear. Provided you understand how it can work, there are ways in which this is the perfect set of rails on which to try to run a more neo-mercantilist policy. Because
Hmm.
then the retort I get from many free traders in Europe is, well, we won't use them. Yeah, why should we do that? If I export to the US now, I get to buy a T-bill, or I get to buy a treasury bond, or I get to buy US equity with the dollars that I earn. I have complete freedom to decide how I want to invest that back in the US, those earnings from selling to the US.
Hmm.
That's the euro dollar system. And I said, you have them because America grants them to you. And if you don't want that, don't sell to the US and then watch your entire economy topple because either directly, second order, third order, everyone is still reliant, more or less, on the US consumer.
Right.
So, yeah,
And
you can have that choice. You can walk away tomorrow right now if you want. Good luck to you, sir.
yeah, and that's at the national level, right? Where maybe they might have reasons where they do want to not be as dependent upon the dollar, whatever. But then there's the civilian, I guess, layer in these countries where most of these countries, a lot of people would love access to dollars, but it's not easy for them to buy treasury bills or even get their hands on dollars. All of a sudden, the stable coin lets them do that. They can buy, save, transact in a dollar composite, not composite, but a dollar substitute or whatever. But it's for their intents and purposes, as long as the stable coin does its job of holding its value the way it's supposed to, it's effectively the same thing for them. So even if the government might decide, I want to do less business with dollars with the US, their citizenry might say, screw that. I'm getting those stable coins as fast as I can.
Absolutely. Unless the government says you can't have them, and then I would imagine the White House or the Treasury or the Pentagon will be on the phone and say, "Yeah, nice NATO membership that you've got there, but
Right.
pity if that that's the way the game will work."
I think
Absolutely.
that's true, but even flip it. Like, let's say that country doesn't care what the US response is. What would you need to do to cut off your citizens' access to stablecoins? I mean, it would have to be a very draconian constraint you're putting out there, like we are limiting access to the internet, or it's not easy to stop, is my point. Like the country would really have to ask itself, how much am I willing to piss off my citizens to try to limit this? And I think they could only do pretty extreme tactics here, and I think very quickly for most countries to probably blow up in their face.
I would agree with you. I think you'll be surprised how many might give it a try, and then find out that that's what happens. But
I mean, do you think Greece or Italy or Turkey or a country like that would be willing to tell its citizens, you can't have access to this, and we're gonna do what we need to do to prevent you from getting access to it, which would be again super unpopular, like limiting access to the internet, or we're gonna imprison you if we find that you used stable coins. Like I just find it hard that a country like those at least. Sure, China, yeah, whatever, but they're already their citizens are used to a very heavy hand hanging over them. Um, I don't know. I could be wrong, but
Well, I don't think it will happen within Europe without getting into European politics. I don't think it will happen at the national level. That's going to happen at the pan-European level. And it wouldn't surprise me if you didn't see the European Commission or the ECB come out and say, well, we're going to mirror what the Genius Act says, which is no foreign stablecoin can operate here. Now, fair enough, if they want to do that, then they miss out entirely. The population may be really annoyed. Nothing that they do domestically is likely to be able to have the same international impact that the dollar stablecoin does,
mhm,
because the dollar stablecoin will still be the dollar. So effectively, you just decouple yourself from more and more of the global economy. Everyone else will be using it, and you say, I can't transact in that. So
right.
that's where I think it will go. That's above and beyond the fact that it will be linked to LNG, it will be linked to NATO, it will be linked to tariffs. But let me just use my methodology that is how I see everything, or I try to see everything. I look at these hypothetical ideas and I project them forward to the logical endpoint, this direction or that direction. And so on one level, if they really work well for the US, and of course there'll be bumps in the road and misapplication, and it can go horribly wrong. Let's presume they work well. Well, the US ends up basically getting a lot of stuff for free and creates like a third dimension to the two-dimensional balance sheets we're looking at the moment, which give it a lot of stuff without the liabilities, which, if directly and carefully applied, will help it reindustrialize and rearm and do everything it needs to do. And if it doesn't work, and the rest of the world, like Europe, says we're out, we're out, we're out, we're out, bit by bit, after a transition, and I'm not saying it will be an easy transition, well, none of those are exporting to the US anymore. Ergo, the US will have to reindustrialize because no one's selling to it.
Yeah.
So
No, I
either way, you end up getting what you want, but one way's
yeah.
nicer than the other.
Yeah, I agree with that logic. I probabilistically, I find it really hard that Europe would intentionally dramatically wean itself off of trade with the US. So I think it's a low probability, but you're right. If it were to happen, it just adds fuel to the fire of reshoring here in the US. Um, and there's already, as you were saying earlier, like there's already some evidence here that the US, via these policies, which not everybody has to like, um, is increasing its access to stuff. And I think oil is a great example. Um, right now, because the strait's closed, the world has to turn to buyers, right? And so America has been exporting record amounts of oil because it's trying to fill that gap, and there's certainly a bunch of demand for it. I've made the argument, who knows if it'll be true or not, but that when the strait does reopen, whenever that is, I think there's going to be a lot less trade done through it than was done pre-war because most countries are going to say, we underestimated the geopolitical risk of that place. And even if they're willing to cut us a discount, I'd much rather just have a predictable source from a country that has a lot less geopolitical risk. And that's going to benefit the Americas and the Mexicos and the Canadas and some of these other large oil exporters that can respond to this shift in demand. Um, so I guess I'm saying is I think these tactics are already kind of bearing the type of fruit that you're expecting to see more of going forward.
They are. Again, as with refineries, it's going to take a couple of years.
Sure.
But the number of plans being really rapidly pushed forward, by the way, very often with American backing in the background
Right.
to get pipelines built out of the Middle East in different directions so you don't have to go through Hormuz and you can get refined product as well as just crude.
Crude. Yeah.
They're really significant. Obviously, of course, Iran, I mean, it's an important point to stress because I don't want anyone to think that this is a cakewalk that I'm describing here. I mentioned earlier to you that I think the US, alongside this economic warfare, is likely to go back to real military stance after the midterms.
Yep.
Well, I was muttering this, looking at regional intelligence and logic, and then the Wall Street Journal picked up on it, and suddenly it became a whole big thing recently, which is that Iran is itself apparently considering escalating well ahead of the midterms because it
Sure.
can see that it's currently on a glide path where it doesn't get what it wants.
Mm-hmm.
And when it doesn't get what it wants, the only way to get what it wants is to start blowing things up again.
Yeah, it's to
So
take a hostage in the region. Yeah.
indeed, I mean, it's a school of thought that's very unpleasant, but it's certainly working for them. So were that to happen, there is a possibility that we get a massive escalation long beforehand. And if so, then everything that we're discussing here is brought to a head even sooner.
Even sooner.
But,
Yeah.
but part and parcel of that in the background, I can assure you, is who's going to take sides with who or with whom, thinking on the other side of this, what does the world look like and where are my pipelines going to be running from and which currency am I going to be paid in?
Mm-hmm.
And it's really existential. And if the US emerges from this mess with the Middle East reordered the way it wants it to, with the pipelines running west,
Yeah.
and the
Which
UAE, which
they're
trusts
right
around.
now pursuing with alacrity. So it's heading in the direction the US
Absolutely.
wants. Yeah.
Absolutely. Then that really, it doesn't solve problems, because trust me, there are a lot of other issues in the Middle East that will still take a long time to address, if they ever can be addressed. But it certainly reorders things significantly to its benefit. Of course, if the US loses this, the inverse is true. Suddenly, the pipeline payment currencies, that all the systems, look much more favorable to a different camp, i.e., Iran running the region alongside Russia and China and Korea, as a grouping, or no one running it, and absolute chaos. I mean, there is a downside scenario here where the entire region absolutely goes up in flames. I don't think that's what's going to happen. That's not my base case.
Yeah.
But if Iran said, right, we're taking out every desalination plant and every refinery in the region, we're in an absolute world of hurt, and the region itself is in tremendous trouble. So it's a very, very, very high stakes game being played here, and the only way to play it is to understand A, that is the game. B, the rules are mixed martial arts plus
Yeah.
eye gouging,
Meaning
biting,
do whatever it takes. Yeah.
do whatever it takes. And when you understand that, then look at the treasury curve. Then look at what's happening with the dollar and put it in some kind of context.
Got it. And I do think, somebody who runs a financial podcast channel, I do think sometimes we give more importance to the financial side of things than sometimes it merits. And I hear what you're saying is hey, it's important. Like it's definitely influential. It definitely has its role to play. But when it comes to key decisions that countries are making, or when it comes to just getting access to real things, atoms, not digits, it doesn't trump the world of supply.
Absolutely. And I fully understand whatever industry one is in, that over your professional career tends to become the be all and end all. I don't actually know any bakers, but I bet if you meet people who really bake, they talk about yeast and dough, right?
Yeah,
and
it's
ovens
the
a lot.
lens they see the world through. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. So this is completely natural, and finance, obviously, given how it's been on a pedestal for 40 years, is going to see itself as the beginning and end of everything. I don't think that is going to be true going forward. And I think if you are asking the question, or forced to ask the question, what is GDP for? Very necessarily, given what a big slice of GDP it is, you will have to ask the question, what is finance for? And if you don't ask it yourself, you will be asked it at some point by
Yes.
someone, or the operating network and system around you will shift to ask that question to you directly.
Yeah, great. And just the simple explanation in my mind is a lot of people think of the finance industry as the dog. It is the thing that kind of rules everything else. And you're doing a good job of giving a reality check and saying, no, it's an important appendage, but it's not the dog.
Yeah, there's a very crude British idiom that I could throw in there, but I won't do. Anyone,
Okay.
anyone British will immediately start smirking, but I'll leave it at that.
Okay. All right. I just want to note, though, that Michael was nodding his head while I was saying that. Real quick, Michael, I remembered the name of the stablecoin company, Tether. That's the one I was
Tether,
trying to
yes,
pull from my
yes.
brain. Okay. I think we've covered stablecoins in and out here, so I don't want to rehash that unless you want to. Um,
Well, just one more thing on that, very quickly, very
yeah,
quickly. It's one other element that we didn't touch on, which is really important too. That when you want to go down this economic statecraft route, I've just described the macro environment, the
yeah,
trading environment, the capital flows. If you're asking what is GDP for, you still need a mechanism to make sure that the right things are being done within the economy.
mm-hmm.
Now, you're either going to do that the old-fashioned way, which is you issue lots of treasury bonds and treasury bills, and the government does everything,
Yep,
or you have private sector doing it for you. And I do believe, and we don't need to unpack this. I'm just throwing it out there for
yep,
completeness' sake, that if they're incentivized right, particularly as stablecoin issuers, who are effectively creating liquidity of a sort which isn't liquidity, it's quasi
yeah.
liquidity, etc.
It's
Um, you know,
non-inflationary liquidity, which is very important. But yeah, go ahead.
yeah, yeah. You can see that can also be used as a mechanism to get the dynamics of the cutting edge private sector, who can see some emerging new industry node coming up that they really want to, get growing in a way that a bureaucrat in Washington, D.C. would never see.
Yeah,
They can do it in a decentralized, more atomized manner, well ahead of anything centralized, in a bureaucratic, traditional post-World War II paperwork kind of fashion. So I just
yep.
want to throw that in there too.
No, I think it's really important. And uh, yeah, I think a lot of people would say I'd much rather have the private sector do whatever versus the government. As you said, the most important thing there is getting the incentives aligned to get the private industry to do this. But I think we're already seeing some really notable examples of this. So let's take the data center build out, right? Government really wants us to win the AI race, right? But it is not financing the data center build out. It has gotten all the hyperscalers excited enough and given them free rein to basically build as many as they can as quickly as they can.
That's a really good example. And by the way, I don't know where you wanted to go next. And if you don't want to go here, we can go straight back to where you wanted to go. What's interesting on that is, while we're again describing this from the meta level, looking down, um, more and more headlines are coming through, certainly in the press I'm seeing, about a political backlash to data centers, because all of this excitement and this growth and this hyper scaling, for Joe Public, it's like, well, my electricity bills are going up. I'm seeing fields turned into these giant metal boxes,
Right. And the
um,
compute these
and,
things are making may put me out of a job, right? I
and
mean,
they
right.
may put me out of a job.
Yeah.
Exactly. So if you're asking what is GDP for, you can't only do that central planning style, as in this will be good for you. We are going to do this. You have to make sure that the man and woman in the street absolutely feels that they're getting something from it. I mean, far be it from me to tell anyone in America what to do, but the obvious knee-jerk response would be every single local region that's getting an AI center built or a data center built. Why the hell aren't those people seeing massive cuts in their local taxes, or
Right.
some kind of incentive in hand to show, hey, we're a steel town, we're a coal mining town, whatever, which we're not the greatest industries in the world in terms of the totality of, clean air, et cetera, but we're proud of it because, there are good jobs here, there's investment in the community, et cetera, et cetera. If that's not there, it doesn't surprise me that you just see people looking at stocks going through the roof, worried about losing their job. I don't want it. So I think there'll have to be a political pivot on that front as well.
I totally agree. And as you said, we're seeing resistance to data center spread. Um, all I'll say is, assuming that AI plays out the way that the hyperscalers expect, the logic should be, okay, you're going to make a ton of profit off of this data center. So at a minimum, you should be making sure that it doesn't increase our electrical bill. But even better, to build the data center here, you got to dedicate X% of profits are going to go back into, a public fund for reducing all of our energy bills, right? I mean, you want to try to find a reason for it to be a benefit for the community, not just a threat, right?
100%. And what are we talking about there? We're talking about a voluntary, because it wouldn't be legislated, hopefully, a voluntary dynamic market system underneath the umbrella of economic statecraft, where actually people feel better off. And at the same time, national power, however you want to measure it, is increasing. This is the game, but you have to have all of it. You have to bring everyone with you. You can't make people feel better off without boosting national power. That doesn't last in the long run. You can't boost national power without making people feel better off and have it sustainable in a democracy. You've got to find a way to bridge it. It's not that hard, but it requires more original thinking than, ka-ching, ka-ching every 3 months, which is basically how Wall Street thinks about things now.
And what's good is I think there's a financial solution, right? I just gave a good example of what one could look like. But there's also technology solutions that are riding to the rescue. They're going to take a while. But we need to rebuild our energy grid. Everybody knows that. We knew that pre-AI. Now we really need to rebuild it because we need to try to at least catch up to China in terms of national energy production. And there's a lot of cool new technologies that are getting approved that I think should have been approved decades ago. I'm specifically thinking about nuclear, but nuclear microreactors can be a fantastic solution here, right? Where it's on site, so the data center doesn't even need to tap into the grid. It is silent, which is another big issue. It doesn't require water, so it takes away a lot of the issues. And it provides always on, dependable baseload power to the data center. And the community doesn't really even notice it. I mean, they'll notice the data center, obviously, but these microreactors they're not that big. I mean, they're, I don't know, 10 feet by 10 feet. So there are a lot of potential ways to solve this, either financially or through technological innovation.
Sure. And I think a counterpoint to that, which actually makes the same argument, is if you want to try and do the entire thing with renewables, good as renewables are, I speak to you with solar panels on my roof, providing the power, for me to have this conversation with you. And there's a hybrid car on my drive. If you're going to do it purely through that on a national level, then you have to have an awful lot more copper, because you're going to have multiple levels of the transmission system to allow for periods where you have a surge relative to the base.
Right.
So you have to look at the totality of the system. And that's true for everything that I'm describing here, looking at the totality of the system rather than just the individual project.
Yeah. And I will note that the commodity folks that I interview, all of them recent months, when I ask them about what they're most excited about, copper is like at the top of their list. Yeah. And for much of this reason, I mean, an energy grid rebuild is just going to take a ferocious amount of copper. And of course, that's just the US, and a lot of other countries are trying to do the same. Okay, so we're getting near the hour. If you want to go long, that's fine. I think the audience will take as much time as you're willing to give, Michael. But let's get back to the theme, which is kind of the 3,000-foot level of what's going on here. Are there any other major trends or developments going on that we haven't talked about yet that you think are worth putting into the conversation here?
Yeah, sure. Let me just throw them in kind of scattergun style, but they all are different pieces, this same jigsaw puzzle. So, for example, we've got Trump trying to talk to Kim in North Korea again, and all the headlines and hoo-ha about him scaling back military exercises with South Korea.
Right.
That's because I think South Korea actually is happy about that. South Korea was already making outreach towards North Korea. Trump says, right, let's not have these really saber-rattling games on the same scale on his doorstep. I don't think it will necessarily work, but I can see what he's aiming for, because North Korea, in a separate geography, the whisper is they're about to send 50,000 men to Ukraine to fight.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. And they're already supplying them with munitions. And simultaneously,
just one more reason to want to live in North Korea, right?
Exactly. Well, I mean, the 50,000 men, maybe won't be for much longer. But Russia, simultaneously to this, the whisper there, if you listen to these things, is that after their parliamentary, called the Duma election, September 1920, so September 21st onwards, they may mobilize, they may escalate, because they're being smashed by Ukrainian drones.
Right.
And Ukraine is very close with really brilliant, innovative, cutting edge, incredibly dynamic economic ecosystems for creating drones in particular, which adapt daily from real-time information. Totally different from how the Pentagon's doing it. We all need to look at that in terms of how
Yeah,
it works.
Ukraine, no doubt, is the cutting edge of drone technology right now.
100%, 100%. So they're close to also now developing long-range strike missiles of their own as well. So they don't need to rely on the US or European versions.
Yep.
So if they do that, and you consider how hard they're hitting Russian logistics and infrastructure and refineries right now, because exports of Russian refined product have dropped by half.
I've dropped a lot.
So
Yep.
if they can really accelerate that, they're going to get hurt even more. So Putin may escalate alongside those 50,000. He may find another couple of 100,000 young men who he can round up from even places like Moscow and St. Petersburg. And we can see a further step up in the war. There's even a risk, and again, this is just the whisper. I'm not saying I'm hearing it directly or anything. And you see it in some headlines, but maybe not in the States or North America, that Putin might even try and put a foot over the line into a NATO country, just to test and see if NATO then says, right, we're at war with you, or says, well, you only put a foot over the line.
Yeah.
Or it's only a small country. We're not going to go to war for one of the Baltics. At which point you have already dismantled NATO's Article 5. And if that were to happen, don't rule out Iran escalating on the same day. That if I'm Iran, that's the day that I start firing missiles at everyone in the region again, including, by the way, they're talking about hitting US bases in Europe, in Bulgaria, in Greece, in Cyprus, basically saying, we'll hit whatever we can, wherever we can, as far into Europe as we can. Again, I'm not saying this is going to happen. I just want to stress to people just how mixed martial arts this is, just how much eye gouging and nail digging and biting that there could be coming up. And any kind of plan that anyone from the US to Russia to China to Europe is trying to put together has to be cognizant of these risks. And obviously for financial markets, the volatility that's implied in what I'm suggesting could happen is enormous, to the point where what we've seen so far in terms of the government stepping in and saying, well, okay, this far and no farther in terms of markets, well, we ain't seen nothing yet, potentially.
Okay, that's what I'm taking from what you're saying, which is if the Russia, Ukraine, and the US-Iran wars have been giving you heartburn, strap in, because it could get an awful lot worse.
Could. Doesn't mean it will.
You're not calling for it to, but you can see the potential that it could happen.
Well, logically, if one front is going to escalate, it makes perfect sense for all of them to escalate in tandem, because that's when you put the most pressure on the Western system. And that's when we find out, what bends and what breaks.
Really interesting. Okay, I got a lot of questions around that, but we don't have a lot of time left, so let's leave that. Any other major trends, developments that you want to get on the table here?
Incredibly quickly, and a headline that just flashed through this morning, my time, just before we spoke, which is that I believe Trump's just introduced a new executive order to massively increase space launches within the US, looking for new launch sites. And I think the target he's talking about is 1,000 launches a year.
Okay.
So if you think everything on Earth is a mess at the moment, and it's pretty hard to think it isn't, well, look up. Because I think things are about to start getting very contested up in space too.
And I'm curious on that one. So the US already dominates in space launches, right? If you look at I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I did actually heard something about it today, that if you take the US's launches and then you combine the rest of the world's, we just blow everybody. We blow the collective rest of the world out of the water already. So for really ramping up space launches, and it's interesting that the launches themselves is the KPI, the key metric that Trump's looking at. Why are we doing that? Is it to try to get a working base on the moon as fast as we can, and then that opens up not only further space exploration, but maybe space mining? Or is it just to get our adversaries, like we did versus the Soviet Union, pressure them into trying to compete with us and then kind of bankrupt them in the process?
It may be a little of the latter, but that is a dangerous game to play for the West, given where it's starting from. I think it leans much more towards the former. I won't profess to be an expert. What I always do on these things is speak to experts before taking a view on them. And I haven't had a long conversation about it with them, but certainly, the talking points that have been passed my way are, yes, there are huge economic opportunities in space. but what it will require is the cost per journey to come way down in the same way that,
Correct.
well, you know what marginal
Yeah.
cost is in any other industry. So the same thing needs to happen. If you've got 3 space launches a week in the US, which is the target that this executive order is talking about, like, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, every week there's a rocket going up.
Yeah.
That's a very different world to the one we operate in now in that sphere.
Yeah. And that is, I mean, to the extent that pushes us decades ahead, and we're already decades ahead of most countries on the planet, but if that pushes us decades ahead of our nearest competitors, that is a big strategic advantage. If you really truly have cost-effective launchability and dependability of the launch, right? Like, you're going to return the rocket with the crew intact, and the rocket's probably going to self-land itself so it can be reused. That actually is a pretty major advantage. If we were able to pull it off, that we win the AI race at the same time, whoa, I mean, those things could be great for America.
They could, and let's put them back in the context that we started with. Have you had examples historically of countries that had cutting edge space technology and yet had a collapsing economy, collapsing currency, interest rates through the roof? Well, yeah, Russia,
Mhm.
in a period in which I lived in it. But generally speaking, you would imagine if America can pull this off, you know, it doesn't help. It doesn't half help support the argument for stablecoins internationally. If that's kind of, hey, look, this is the country that's got space launches that make money, with all the goodies that come with it, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, etc. That doesn't half therefore help the argument for buying T-bills to push down the cost of borrowing at the short end to then allow people to be, lending domestically within this new kind of crypto nexus, which allows you to find the next cutting edge technology with, reshored supply chains. Again, I'm giving you an idealized version of it, right? Lots
Yeah.
and lots and lots of things can go wrong, but there's a lot to be excited about in terms of what could go right if you're American, to be worried about if you're not American, and certainly to be looking at in terms of the financial market and real economy trade flow implications wherever you sit.
Okay. And look, I'm pro America. I'm pro the American side because I am an American. I live in America, so there's the selfish desire to want to be on the winning team. I also think generally, with all its flaws, there are many. America has been probably the greatest force for good in the world geopolitically. I know everybody else won't agree necessarily with that. Not everybody will agree with it, but I think it's a pretty easy argument to make. So I want to see that success continue, in the way that it's not just America doing well, but America is helping the rest of the world do well too. It's helpful, though, always to talk to folks like you, Michael. I mean, one, you're such a fantastic domain expert in general on this whole topic of the new world order that we live in. But you also live outside of the U.S. You were born outside of the U.S. You lived in Russia for part of your life. So you've got a much better global perspective than the average American does. So, where you're not tied to you don't have the same pressures, selfish interests that I do. Um, I always ask you when you're on, hey, if you were playing a game of Risk and to start, you had to pick a country in the world to be your starting place, where would you want to start from? And for a while back there, I think your answer is pretty much has always been America. For about a year ago or so, you were saying, "Well, China's actually doing pretty well here." You weren't ready to start on Team China, but you were saying, hey, they're becoming a much more strong competitor. I think the last time we talked, you dialed that back a little bit. So I guess my question for you if you had to pick today on that risk board, what country would you start with?
Well, I don't think I've made this joke to you before, but I like starting with Australia when I play Risk because no one can invade you. Like, it's not a round world.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you're
No,
down there in the corner, and
I'm
no
with
one
you
can get
too.
you.
I always try to start with Australia and then just get those extra 2 armies every time and just
Yeah,
slowly build my base and then try to invade. Yeah.
exactly. And if only Australia actually had an extra 2 armies in the real world. But on balance, I'm going to stick with where I was. I'm marginally more optimistic than last time we spoke,
I'm kind of
but
detecting that. I didn't want to put that word in your mouth, but I've been detecting that in this conversation.
well, I mean, there is so much doom and gloom out there. I don't ever take the counterpoint to everything just to take the counterpoint. A lot of the
Mhm.
time, I go along with the trend. I independently make up my mind on everything. But while there are enormous storm clouds gathering, within that chaos, everyone else gets buffeted by it too. I mean, for example, let's just for a second, go back and talk about this yield curve thing. I already mentioned it. The people who are being absolutely outraged by what's just happened weren't outraged when the Fed did it because markets. They're only kind of outraged that the Treasury is doing it now because statecraft.
Hmm.
So it's perfectly okay to do it in order to get the stock market to go up. It's not okay to do it in order to do things besides the stock market going up, which it is going up, by the way. But equally, have you seen what the ECB's been doing? Have you seen what the BOJ's been doing? Have you seen, what the Bank of England did with gilts, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera?
All sorts of intervention. Yep.
Well, and the PBOC, what do you think the PBOC is doing left, right, and center in different ways, right? Lots and lots of dirty shirts out there. So it's by no means a gimme. It's a very, very big challenge coming up, absolutely. But I think through that, America has still a better chance of prevailing and coming out stronger than it does collapsing. And as I also point out to people who kind of tend to rub their hands a little bit gleefully, thinking, well, America will collapse, particularly if they're based in the West. Well, it will collapse on you. So, there's no world in which America collapses and some other constellation, sorry, it is a constellation of constellation steps forward and says, hey, we're Australia and Canada, we're going to rule the world. It's not going to happen. So if you are in the broader West, I think you want to try and be optimistic, regardless of regardless of how you may feel about things.
Yeah, that's a great summary. And even it's funny. Um, I get your argument and I agree with it that it's not like if America stumbles, some other country is going to naturally just sort of step up and become the world superpower. I don't think that's likely for all your reasons and maybe even a few more. But even China, right? America, just does a faceplant here. America's China's largest trading partner, right? I mean, it's not like China's going to come away uninjured by failing America, correct?
Correct, absolutely. I mean, in fact, you've seen a recent report from the US talking about transshipment with a Trojan horse on the front, very appropriate for the
Hmm.
summer where we've had
The
the Odyssey
Odyssey.
come
Yeah.
out. And underlining that China is in some instances going thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers, tens of thousands of kilometers out of its way to try and get products into other countries to get the stamp put on them that came from there to still sell to
Right.
America.
Yeah.
And let's say America does completely stumble. China is building up its exports to the rest of the world. They are now larger than to most other places. A lot of that's to Europe. Europe is about to push back hard, it would appear. So finally, after having resisted and laughed at everything Trump did, from a trade perspective, Europe may end up following it, which could
Right.
ironically therefore bring the US and Europe together. Again, something I've been suggesting was logical for a long period of time. But the rest of the world, unless it's raw materials, China basically sells and doesn't buy much from those countries. So were it to end up just dealing with those guys, fine, how are you going to prop them up?
Right.
Effectively, you're running the trade surplus with them. You're going to have to keep pumping your money into them to get them buying from you. And ultimately, that doesn't end too well, as we saw with Germany and Greece. So it's a messy, messy, messy global system we're in now. And one of the reasons on an underlying basis why I am optimistic, if you see it coming through, is because I am not, and have not been for the longest time, a believer that the world that we had pre-Trump was in any way fair,
The best. Yeah.
equitable, or sustainable. It wasn't. It was an accident waiting to happen, and that accident's now happening. But on the other side of it, maybe we build a more crash-proof car.
Yeah. I totally get that, especially with your long arc study of just global geopolitical dynamics that, globalization, that was not the norm, that was the aberration, right? And
Yep.
like it or not, we're returning to the system that really pretty much ruled the world for centuries. And just hopefully, maybe we'll do a better time of it this time around.
Well, we travel in hope.
We travel and hope. That's a great way to say it, my brother. Okay, so one last big question for you, unless you've got some other key themes you want to squeeze in here. Um, and it's the one I know you don't love answering. So apologies for that. But uh, while not being personal financial advice to anybody, are there key investment themes that you see coming out of the action that you see right now? I kind of threw two up there, I think, earlier. One was commodities should probably do well on a relative basis here. Um, and well, I guess we didn't really get into where you think the direction of interest rates are going, but if stablecoins help lower bond yields, then maybe actually bonds will have a good secular period ahead of them.
Well, those two are linked, and I agree with both. So commodities are very clear in a more zero-sum, neo-mercantilist, rearming world where supply chains are being deliberately disrupted as a strategy to
Hmm.
make sure that stuff is expensive for the other side and cheap for you. But of course, they can do that back at you, so it gets disrupted for everybody. Yeah, commodities are a good place to be, absolutely. Although, of course, they need to be tied to something. Pure speculation is not going to be encouraged in this particular, well, world order. They want a world disorder. The powers that be will want to see that you're actually putting it to some use rather than hoarding it, for example.
Right.
So that's
Copper is
one.
to build out the energy grid, not to sit in a warehouse. Yeah.
Exactly, and then be right rehypothecated as money. No, no, no. It has to be something physical. Um, the T-bill argument from stablecoins, I think, is clear, and the FX argument. Now, I'm not in any way giving an FX trade here because I don't do FX strategy. But logically, and looking at the headlines around you, right now, everyone is like, well, the dollar's going to suffer from what the Treasury is doing. Despite the fact that you can say that, well, the yen suffered a lot from what the BOJ was doing, and look at the volatility in the yen.
Hmm.
The euro's gone up and gone down depending on the circumstances, but hasn't always moved one to one with what the ECB has been doing vis-a-vis peripheral bond markets. But let's say that the dollar does have a couple of bad months, which I think is entirely possible on the back of this. I think the people saying that are not making the argument I am for stablecoins. So in other words, you could get really big volatility where you can have a significant move in one direction, and then everything comes screaming back the other way.
All right. Well, thank you so much for providing your best answer to that question, because like I said, I know you generally eschew trying to direct people towards investments. And again, a reminder, these are just themes we're talking about, and they're secular themes, meaning there will be cyclical times where this trade works really well and where it doesn't work at all. But over the long arc of what you see coming, you think those are decent themes. All right, my friend, it is always it's just really fun to have these discussions with you. I very much appreciate you making the time to do it. And obviously, not only they're fun, but they're very informative. There are a few people with your kind of holistic geopolitical expertise, Michael, and it really is a privilege to have it here on this channel. So thank you. And my question around that is for folks that would like to follow you in your work in between now and the next time you appear on this channel, where should they go?
Sure. Well, if you're a Rabobank client, you can find my work in its totality on Rabobank Knowledge, but you do have to be one of our clients. If you're not, you can find some of my work on LinkedIn. And if you don't want to go there, I like to continue the conversation on X, and my handle is all one word at the Michael Every. So come and join the conversation.
Yeah, I would change your handle to the only Michael Every that matters, because you're such a great mind. I've been following you at Twitter pretty much since you started your X account. And I highly recommend everybody watching, if they don't already follow you there and they like your work, they should definitely go follow that. Michael is, I won't say prolific, but you do post pretty frequently. I would say daily. And a lot of the things that we've talked about in this discussion, the genesis, the initial thought of it, first or very early on appears on X. So it's a really great way to see how Michael, sees the world on a real-time basis. But it's really interesting to see how he'll get an idea, and then over the next couple of days, he'll just flesh it out more, build on it, and then start to tie it to everything that's happening in the world. So it's a great account. You do a great job, Michael.
Thank you very much. So do you.
You're so kind. Okay, well, we'll start wrapping it up here. So, folks, first off, please join me in thanking Michael for giving us so much of his time and his expertise here today. He went long for us very generously. Do that, show him that gratitude by hitting the like button and then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. All right, Michael, thanks for being patient through that. Let's definitely do this a bit later in the year for an update on your view, and we'll inform everybody about it. But I just, again, just want to thank you for the role you're playing out there for so many, myself at the top of the list, and giving us such a great expanded way to sort of see what's happening around the world with these major trends and then tie it all together for us in sort of your unifying overall view. It's incredibly useful, and in my opinion, the world needs a lot more Michael Everys.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the platform to share it.
Ah, no, you anytime, my friend, and literally anytime. If you see something that's happening out of cycle that you want to get the word out about, please let me know, and we'll have you right back on the channel ASAP. And like I said, I think the world needs a lot more Michael Everys. That said, I stand by my claim that you're the only Michael Every that really truly matters.
Well, thank you very much. I'll tell my wife.
Please do. And please apologize to her for me keeping you here a bit late. But it's been wonderful, my friend. Again, I hope we see you again soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, well, now's the time on the program where we bring in the lead partners from New Harbor Financial. Today, it's just going to be the lead partner. John Loder has the week off, but we've got Mike Preston. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
Glad to be here, Adam. Thank you.
All right, so obviously, I want to hear any key reactions you have to the conversation there with Michael, which I thought was a great conversation. And then I want to get more into a little bit of philosophy, but also still money management with you. So if we've got time left for that, I'll try to take it there.
Sure, I'll try to keep it brief. I really enjoyed the talk you had with Michael. You guys talked a lot about big picture economic and macro themes. These themes are important to us presently, but more importantly, over the next 10 or more years. A big theme that you and Michael talked about was globalization, or a move from globalization, I should say, towards what I think Michael called was statecraft, or basically protecting your own interests. So there's going to be more of that and less globalization. Uh, Talked about how there might be some yield curve control. Treasury Secretary Bessent came out and said, we're going to buy some of the long-term bonds. The Treasury market had a little bit of a lift, not a huge one yet, but I can tell you that sentiment has been really bad in bonds as interest rates have been going up. And so we might be seeing the beginning of a bigger move. And Michael thinks that there's going to be more of that, potentially yield curve control, which includes issuing Treasury bills. You can issue a ton of short-term Treasury bills. You can take that cash, or the government can take that cash and buy long-term Treasuries. The more that they buy on the long end, the more that long-term interest rates go down, thereby allowing the U.S. to pay for the debt better. So you can only issue T-bills if there's a demand for T-bills. So there is a demand for T-bills now, but in comes the subject or the theme of stablecoins. You and Michael talked about stablecoins and how this could create massive treasury bill demand, because stablecoins are backed by a risk-free asset. So you can't really create a stablecoin without saying that something protects its value. And the most common thing is a United States Treasury bill. So if stablecoins are more introduced and they're tied to treasury bills, because they could also be tied to other things, but the US has a big piece to play here. There's a lot at stake. If the US can convince the world and the financial market players to tie these stable coins to treasury bills, and then furthermore, create a demand for global trade settled in these stable coins, that could create a giant demand for treasury bills, right? So that would be good.
And sorry, just to interrupt, a point that I made there with Michael is the difference between the the U.S. doing this, and I think stablecoins would be led more by the Treasury, I imagine. Um, it's different from QE. So the Fed has oftentimes played a similar role, right, where it's stepped in to buy U.S. Treasury debt to try to bring yields down. But in doing so, it's basically monetizing the debt. It's increasing the money supply. It's devaluing the dollar. In this case, U.S. Treasury issued stablecoin would not be adding to the money supply. It would be creating additional dollar-like instruments outside of the U.S. but it wouldn't have the inflationary impact in the U.S. or the debasement element for the currency that's like a Fed QE would have. So I find this really interesting. I mean, it really could be a pretty amazing either lifeline, if you want to look at it that way, to get the rates down to reduce our borrowing costs. But also it could be just a bonanza in terms of bringing just a lot more foreign capital into America's borders.
It's absolutely huge, and there's so much at stake here, right? The United States has had an advantage. Some would say an unfair advantage going all the way back to, I'd say, the 1960s when Henry Kissinger convinced the Saudis to do all trade in dollars. After that time, the dollar became the world's reserve currency, and that only strengthened over time. That's given us an enormous advantage. If we want 50 more tanks, we print the money and we get them, right? And so there's a lot at stake here because the next 10 to 20 years is going to be an era, I believe, of commodities dominance. And there's only going to be more energy traded, more carbon, more charcoal, more natural gas, more everything, right? And how is all of that trade going to be settled? There's a lot at stake because the ultimate reserve currency, and if it's moving towards stablecoins backed by the US, that would be a huge win for the US. And we would have another huge era of essentially world's reserve currency and power and advantage. Now, the rest of the world may not concede to that. That's what's at stake. But Michael points out in the interview that here's the stakes. What direction do the pipelines go, east or west?
Hmm.
Who controls how it flows? And what country does trade get paid, get settled in? What currency does all this get settled in? So if it's stablecoins backed by the US dollar, we have decades of dominance ahead of us. If it's some other country, some other currency, it's going to be a big blow to us. And I'm not even sure that we would concede to that without some type of conflict. So that's
Right.
that's really what's at stake.
I agree with that, although I do have a hard time identifying another currency currently on the game board that the world would turn to instead of the dollar.
I agree. And the vast amount of euro dollar dollars out in the euro dollar system, I think is 100 trillion or more. No one really knows. So that's not easy to walk away from. A lot of people talk about the BRICS developing a trade currency and the dollar collapsing. Michael says at the end, so I'm getting to his ultimate, highlights of like what he believes in. He says at the end, don't worry about the US dollar collapsing. It's not going to happen, at least not soon. And the Eurodollar system kind of is part of the piece of the puzzle that explains that. And what you just said, what else is there right now? We don't know. Maybe gold back. That's the only other thing I could think of. Maybe it'll be gold. We'll see. But he's also bullish. These are the things he's bullish on: commodities and treasury bonds, maybe treasury bonds. So being bullish on treasury bills themselves is pretty difficult because even if there's a huge demand increase, the price of these T-bills is not going to go up by much, but
Right.
we think there's an opportunity in the 10 plus year US Treasuries. And so we have a small position in an ETF that tracks that TLT, 7.5% of our model. We think that we're going to see a bounce in those prices and a drop in interest rates. And frankly, it might have already happened. We've had a lot of capitulation, a lot of clients and prospective clients have been concerned about long-term bonds. I mean, and the problem is this kind of static thinking that says, oh, we're going to have inflation, bonds are bad. Well, that's probably true over 20 years, but that's not necessarily true over 2 years. Both can be true. We could have a big move up in bond prices over the next 2 years based on everything we're talking about here. And then later, inflation could come back in, drive rates up, and then really hurt those bond prices. So we think there's an opportunity in bonds, at least over the next 2 years. We agree with them on commodities. We think we're in a commodities bull market that should last at least 10 years. So those are the themes that we agree with. And I guess I'll pause there.
Okay. Um, so you sort of touched on this, Mike, but you guys at New Harbor, you have the challenge of sort of deciding which long-term trends you think are going to be the big important ones to pay attention to, right? It might be de-globalization, as Michael's been talking about here. It might be the fourth turning, as you and I have talked on this channel a lot. Maybe other trends that are going on here. But these things take a long time to really manifest. As you said, 10, 20 years, right? Um, so while keeping your eye out for what those trends might bring in the future, you also have to trade the market we have today. And so, and sometimes that may conflict with where you think the long-term trends are headed, right? But in the short term, market's performing a certain way and you want to position for that, again, to be able to generate returns for your clients. Can you just talk for a moment about surfing that tension between short-term focus and long-term focus?
It's really difficult. I've got to tell you. I mean, one thing that I underestimated is just how long this could go on. I can say that I learned the hard way. Post Great Financial Crisis, and we had a recession in the GFC, right? But it wasn't really allowed to clear. It was rescued. A ton of money was put into the system. There was a V-shaped recovery. All the bad characters got away with it. And then we focused on wealth effect over the next bunch of years. And then the rich got much richer, and then the middle class benefited, but to a lesser extent. And here we are today. What do we have now? Like maybe 18 years or so past the GFC. And we haven't had really a recession since the Great Financial Crisis. If you
We,
look at
we've
a
had we've had few bad years. I mean, I can remember 2022, but almost besides that, we really haven't had a real painful year since 2008.
That's correct. I mean, I could pull up a chart of recessions, and the Fed likes to put recessions in gray on these charts, and you'll see a little sliver you can barely notice there back in during COVID.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't even a recession. That was not a recession, and the GFC hurt, but it wasn't allowed to correct properly. So we really haven't had a recession since 2008, 2009. That's not normal. It's like we banned recessions. We ban cycles. And in so doing, we put ourselves in a much more precarious spot. So I can tell you the truth. I learned the hard way that things can go on a lot longer. So this is all psychological. You've really got two choices. Just go with the program, index for 50 or 100 years and ignore everything. That works if you can actually ignore everything and you don't need all the money at the exact wrong time. Or
Yeah.
you can be tactical. Yeah, I've learned that things can go much further. And so, therefore, I would say that over the years, we've developed more of a tolerance for some equity exposure, but not much. But I can tell you that, for instance, right now we're 50% in equities. But I think the market will lose two-thirds of its value in the next down market. So should we be 0% in equities? I furthermore think we're going to get a blow off in the market that's going to take us above 8,500 in the S&P probably. Does that mean we should be 100% in equities? This only comes from experience and honing your own style developed by your personality and your skills. Our skills are that we will abandon a position if it breaks down through key levels that we think tells us that we're wrong. We will add hedges to kind of take some of the sting out of a downside move because if we get a big downside move tomorrow, we're going to feel some of that. That's part of what we accept by still being in this game. So it's tough because you have to develop a bias and a belief based on history, based on your own experiences, based on your own system. And you have to almost completely separate yourself from emotion, which is literally the hardest thing to do for anybody, professionals included. It's like a master's class in like observing oneself and developing that presence. It's hard. But I know I'm not telling you view is exactly how mechanically to avoid any and all pain, but I think that you
Well,
have to know where you are and know how to react if something changes.
yeah. And just to be clear, there's no way to provide a guarantee that you'll never have any kind of pain. Even if you just went 100% into T-bills, if the market continues to just go up at every couple thousand points in the S&P, well, that's opportunity cost that you've just lost. So there's really no way to, um, it's all about a net, playing a net game. I'm going to have some losses. I'm going to have some wins. My job is just to make sure I have more wins than losses here. So I've got a positive return and hopefully
That's
one
right.
that beats inflation.
Yeah, and,
Um,
there's ways that the individual can do very well and maybe even beat the indices as long as they know who they are, they hone their strategy based on their personality, and they know what to do when they're wrong. That's really all that it comes down to.
okay. So two things, and we've talked about this in prior um, prior videos. I think the last time we did was after the Darius Dale video. But like Darius, I think you guys have developed an appreciation for riding a trend, right? Which is, hey, if this is where things are going, and more often than not, these things last longer than you think they're going to, play the trend, but just be cautious. And as Darius's whole, you know, unbelievably quantitative model um, indicates, is the key thing is you just got to know when the trend changes, right? You got to know when the trend changes and change with it versus continuing to ride the old trend for too long. And that's when you get in trouble, right? Then the market turns on you and that's where the losses come. So that, and then you mentioned this, you kind of intimated at this, but one of the things that I think your firm does particularly well is risk management, right? Trying to take more of the gains and less of the losses. But in terms of, using hedges and whatnot, which a lot of financial advisors don't have the expertise that you do in that. They just don't use them very much because I think they just don't understand them super well. They don't have a lot of experience in them. But hedges is a great way to continue riding the trend, but give yourself some material protection in case the trend reversal catches you by surprise, right? This is the whole insurance type of thing. So what I find really valuable about that is that it lets you guys, kind of lean in to some of these trends and ride them, but not get caught with your pants down if and when the trend changes before you realize.
Yeah, absolutely. What you're really talking about there is hedges with options, or at least that's how we use these types of hedges.
Mhm.
So we use covered calls, which brings income into the account and allows you to be incorrect in timing. We don't always use covered calls, but we use covered calls when things get extended to the upside or when they start to break down to the downside, but we're not sure that we want to sell that position yet. We will sell a call, which is going to bring income in. So for instance, for $100 stock, we might sell a call, which means that we have to sell it if it goes higher. Let's say in this case $105. We might get like $3 for that call sale. Well, that $3 becomes income and essentially protects us to the extent that the premium is represents $3 of downside protection. So it's not a lot, but if you do that over and over and over again, it brings in income into the account. In fact, I think it's one of the better strategies that an individual retail investor can learn how to create income is by selling options. That's a whole nother
Right.
video,
And,
perhaps.
and and we should probably do one on that, folks. If you're interested in that, let us know in the comments below the video. But what I really like about covered calls is you get a gain, right? From the income that you're talking about, um, and in the way you can get quote unquote burned is if the stock just really takes off. So you're giving up kind of the runaway upside for the stock, but that doesn't happen, all that often to too many stocks. And a lot of the stocks that um, you sell calls on, you have a good sense of what their volatility is, right? And so if they're, not that volatile, it's a pretty safe bet that you're not going to lose too much upside if it gets called away, right? So I just think, yeah, you'd be frustrated if, oh my God, I thought this thing was going to stay flat and it went up by 30% and I missed most of that. But you're not down anything, right? Where a lot of other types of, most other investments, you've got true downside risk, right? Here, again, it's not downside risk, it's just opportunity cost risk.
That's right. And in your example where the stock takes off to the upside and you're capped out, it's true that you lose the additional upside, but it's a gain. You book that gain and you do it over and over again. And it's not just covered calls. Some people execute this strategy by selling naked puts on the same stock. If you sell puts, it's essentially the same trade. You're betting that the stock doesn't go down, and your upside is limited to the premium that you take in. And again, this could be a whole video. The message I want to get out to folks is that if you're a do-it-yourself retail investor, one of the ways that I've seen over my whole career that people actually have some success is by selling options. And you have to know the risks involved, You have to have a system that deals what to do with when you're wrong. But I'm telling you, the selling of options is what professionals do in general, because most options expire worthless. And so if you can do that, it's the get rich slow method versus the get rich fast method. And I would just encourage people to maybe look into that if they're really truly do-it-yourselfers, or, talk to us. And that's part of what we do. And maybe they decide to have us manage or somebody else, or maybe they do it themselves. I'm just trying to tell people that selling options can be one of the very best tools out there to the individual investor, in my opinion.
So I don't disagree with you, but two elements on there. One, you talked about the get rich slow versus get rich fast. All things being equal, everybody would take the get rich fast, but the get rich fast comes with a lot more risk, right? So just know that. Um, and my personal opinion here, I think you share it, Mike, but let me know. Um, if you want to, start using options as a way to reduce risk in your portfolio, I think it's great to get educated on it, but I think you should work with a professional who is very experienced in these things and let them teach you as you go along the process. You don't want to start just cold turkey and have to learn through the school of hard knocks what works and what doesn't work, because that can be a very expensive education with options if you don't know enough about them. You very well be making trades that have a lot more risk than you realize, and you only find that out when all of a sudden you have a really big loss. So I would generally recommend working with an expert for some period of time until you've really demonstrated to them that you've got it.
Absolutely, and happy to help there. Here's the standard disclaimer. Options can be risky. Options are risky. You need to understand how to use them, how they apply to your situation, and you need to be approved for the use of options and demonstrate that you have the financial capability of doing that. So none of this is a direct recommendation, but in general, it's something that some people should look into, and something that we've helped people understand. All of what we talked about there is selling options. Once in a while, we buy options. If the storm clouds gather and they're very dark and we don't really want to sell down a bigger chunk of our equities, we might buy an index put on the S&P or something like it. We don't like buying options because, like I said a minute ago, almost all options expire worthless. And time decay, every single day that goes by, time decay happens and the option's worth less. But buying puts on an index is one thing where you can actually buy an insurance policy that goes way up in value if we get a crash. So once in a while we'll do that, but not all the time. Sometimes people get too caught up in always having index puts on, and it can really burn into your or eat into your return. So I can't tell you exactly when to use them, but I can tell you that we do use them sometimes.
Okay. For folks that don't know much about options, Mike and his partner there at New Harbor put together a video for us. It was probably like a year ago or so, Mike, on kind of just the basics of buying and selling call and put options. So it's a really good introduction to this space, and I think a digestible lesson in sort of how the math works. So if you'd like to watch that after watching this video, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com/hedging. Okay, Mike, we only have a few minutes left, but I want to try to squeeze in this more philosophical topic. We were chatting about it before um, we turned on the camera here, um, but you've got New Harbor now has become so successful over the years that you've got a pretty large clientele base, and I think as you mentioned to me. You're starting to really realize that you're subject to the law of large numbers, which is kind of you're beginning to see kind of all of the bell curve of what could happen. You kind of see all of it now, right? And you've had a number. I'll let you say any more about this than as you want to, but you've had a number of clients, over the years who have had the unexpected happen in their lives, right? They've passed away. Um, they've been in accidents. They've had memory issues as they get older. Um, and uh, they disease, illness, all that type of stuff. And um, I know you'll want to opine, and I say feel free to go do so on kind of what life lessons to take from this, right? In terms of like really focusing on what matters. Money's important, but it's a means to different ends. It's not the end in and of itself. So how can you live richly in the true definition of rich in life? That's super important, and not just be focusing on the money part all the time. Um, and then secondly, I just want to underscore, based on the wisdom of what you're about to say, is I know that the majority of people who watch these videos are DIY investors. And from an age perspective, 2/3 of them appear to be over 50. So, your risk every year of one of these unfortunate events happening in your life goes up. And look, if you're a successful DIY investor, that's fantastic. Keep doing it. But you got to ask yourself, what if one of these unexpected things happen to me and I get a big injury? I start losing my faculties, big illness hits, whatever. Um, how can I make sure that those who depend on me as the guy leading the investment charge, if I'm not around anymore, if I'm too impaired to do that, what's going to be the backup solution, right? And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. But Mike, opine in any ways you want on this.
I'll do my best, Adam, and I'll try not to get preachy. I've learned a lot in my almost 30 years in this business. I learned a lot. When I was younger, I thought that money equaled safety, or at least I thought that partly. But a big part of what we do here at New Harbor, I think, is to help people feel safe. That's the number one goal, to help people feel safe from a financial perspective. And I think that we're really good at that. One thing I've learned is you don't need quite as much as you think you need to feel safe or to actually to be safe. It's an easy psychological trap to be caught up in, to never think that you have enough, because that target is never sufficient. You might say, well, once I have 1 million, I'm good, or 2 million, I'm good, or 5 million, I'm good, or 10 million, I'm good. I can tell you from an experience standpoint with clients over the years, and we have more than 1,000 clients. Once you have 2 to 3 million, you pretty much have won the game. There's not a lot of difference past that. That's what I've seen. Now that I know, I'm talking to a lot of people that don't have that. So please, it's not that I look down on anyone that doesn't have that. I'm just saying that that's what I've seen. You get there and you pretty much have won the game. 3 million versus 10 million, not a big difference. 50 million, you're just going to have maybe more houses, a boat, a plane. It's not a huge difference. So, and there's a huge difference between nothing and something. That's another thing I've learned. I've seen people with maybe 300,000 saved in 401ks. That's a massive difference between nothing. Because 300,000 at a 4 to 5% withdrawal rate adds 1,000 to maybe $1,400 a month in addition on top of your Social Security. So it's important to save early in life, and if not, save quicker later in life to have something. That's a big difference. But we also talk to a lot of people that have much more than that. And I'm telling you, the bigger and bigger numbers don't make a big, big difference. And so you talked about the law of large numbers, and this is the from our perspective, we can see a lot of people, over 1,000. We see everything, good things, bad things. And we really feel for our clients. And even if they're not our clients, and they're just people we've come in contact with and developed a relationship through your program primarily, Adam, we feel connected to them. And remember, a big part of our job is to connect with them, really on a heart-to-heart level, and help them feel like they're not different, right? That's the big thing. From my experience, I can talk to you and say, I can see that you're going to be okay. And it's not BS. I can see that you're going to be okay pretty quickly after looking at the data. I guess like a doctor with 30 years of experience would have. So that's a big part of what we do. And so we feel for these people. And when something bad happens, it hurts, And so unfortunately, we see people with bad medical diagnoses or accidents. And I know a lot of that just cannot be avoided, really. But so what do you do? I guess you put your financial house in order. You try to make sure that you've got assets to protect your loved ones and maybe even income streams, something that we're happy to talk about. Some of these ideas that I talked about, like selling options, are great because you can create good income. But if you were to die, who's going to do that? Right? So it helps to have some passive income sources that generate income, even if you can't do them. And again, just talking about big picture stuff, one piece of advice I'd give to people, particularly younger people, is make sure you own something. Own something, own a piece of a company, own an apartment or two, own some investments. It's a big difference in all the people that we've seen over the years, people that own something and people that just work for a paycheck.
Hmm.
So I know my answer is jumping all over the place, so
No, no,
maybe
no,
I'll
no.
let
And
you
let me
jump
just
in.
build on that, which is, you know, increasingly like it or not, the path to wealth seems to be, you can pretty much boil it down to two things. It's own assets and it's avoid debt, essentially. And the big reason for two of those is one, every policy decision that's been made in the past, I don't know, pretty much your whole career, Mike, almost 30 years, is that whether the intent was, honorable or not, the end result of each of these policies has been asset prices go up further. And so that just benefits those who own assets, right? And then the other side is, and also assets compound over time, right? Their gains and their income will compound over time in your portfolio. And debt is doing the exact opposite, right? The more debt you have, the more compounding is working against you. So, you ideally want to have no compounding debt against you and as many assets as you can have. And obviously, folks, that's a lot easier said than done. But like it or not, that kind of is the simple way of the world right now. Maybe that'll change if future policies change and stuff like that. And there's probably going to be some big clearing events there, like Mike is concerned about that after some blow-off spike, that we probably will have a pretty darn painful correction. But in general, that's kind of a simple formula.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, there's, one thing about these rules is that there's always exceptions to the rules, which makes the game hard to play for young people, right? Because I can also say there's sometimes that debt could be used carefully. If you have an
Correct. Yes.
opportunity.
Productive debt that will yield more income for you over time than the debt expense. Yes. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah. And
That's the exception though.
it's the exception. I mean, obviously, it's pretty common when getting into a house, right? Few people put 100% of the purchase price down when they buy a house. So there are some ways where it can be useful, although in general, I think once you've made that productive debt investment, you want to find a way to start paying it down as much as possible so that the debt service cost isn't compounding on a negative basis on you. All right, I interrupted you there, Mike. Anything else you wanted to say about this before I put the bow on it?
I don't think so. And it gets a little bit into preachiness, but the most important thing is health because we've seen it happen to people, bad diagnoses, unexpected, and then you realize, well, shoot, that number I was shooting for wasn't really even that important. So it's good to have a plan. It's good to have skills to know how to generate income and gains. It's also good to just to know when you're okay and when you're safe. I'm happy to help you feel that by looking at your situation.
Yeah.
And
And I'm
I wish
curious,
for,
Mike, for the folks that come in, as prospects, especially those that are coming here from Thoughtful Money, if you just had to like take a swag at it, what percentage that you look at and you say, yeah, okay, you're going to be okay. And even if you don't feel it that way, let me explain why I think you're better off than maybe you realize, versus, all right, yeah, you're not in great shape right now. We got to figure out a plan to get you into shape as best as possible.
I'd say over 80%.
That's great.
Because, a lot of people come in with less. They come in with like $800,000 401k they've had their whole life. But you look at their situation, they've got a small paid off home. Their lifestyle is such that they can live on $6,000 or $8,000 a month. And once you add their Social Security in, you can see that they can get 4 to 5,000 out of that. We only have to generate 3,000 or so a month out of their investments, which is not going to be a big withdrawal rate. It's pretty cool because most of the time these people have already just auto adjusted themselves into that situation and they're happy. That's the important thing.
Right.
So I can look and say, as long as you tell me you don't need a $200,000 RV or a plane or $100,000 a year vacation budget, I can see you're going to be fine. And by and large, these people are already there where they wouldn't even feel comfortable doing all those things, you know? And then the hardest ones are the ones that I talk to that have 7 million and they're not comfortable till they get to 10, you know? And there's some of those, and I don't want to criticize because I get it. It doesn't feel safe until you hit a big round number and you have a, you know, but you know, with those people, I say very respectfully, challenging them, I say, how do you know you haven't already arrived? You know, and oftentimes we just kind of talk through things and realize they're there. Other people, you know, it's not that often that I come into contact with somebody that really has an issue, but sometimes it is that way. And even then we can talk about some crazy ideas, like relocating to a less expensive place, even another
Yeah.
country, you know, and we talk about those things.
Yeah.
So you're never at your dead end, trust me.
Well, I will tell you, as somebody who recently moved from a very high cost of living state to one that is notably lower, you don't have to leave the country necessarily to have a lower cost of living. In my case, I just had to drive across the state line. And so, it feels daunting about making a big life change. And don't get me wrong, leaving your community and your social support, and having to rebuild it, the new place, it takes time. But I think, having just done it, it's a lot less of a lift than I think most people imagine it's going to be. All right, so two things. So, as you said, Mike, for a lot of people, it's kind of like, yeah, like money's still important, and we're not telling you to just blow all your money from here, but we're telling you that maybe you've already arrived, or maybe you're given your current situation and your momentum, you're going to get there by the time you want to. And so therefore, don't let money be a constant source of anxiety in your life, and maybe spend more of your time on the things that really matter, right? And I say on this channel all the time, true wealth really is quality relationships, living with purpose, and focusing on keeping your health as good as you can, right? And because you don't know if you're the guy whose ticket's going to get punched tomorrow with an accident or an illness or whatever, make sure that you are creating the time in your life to invest in those things that really matter, right? Spend time with your family and your friends. Make sure that you're not just plodding along in some sort of soul-sucking job or whatnot. Again, we're all mortals. We're at some point we're all going to die. So just make sure when and if that time, well, when that time comes in your life, you can look back and say, hey, I actually spent it well. I did things that truly mattered. And then the health stuff, I just think that should be a daily ritual for everybody, because it's just so important. If you don't have that, almost everything else doesn't matter. And then the last point I just want to underscore here for folks is, again, you might be doing everything right now as a DIY investor, but fate might throw you a curveball where all of a sudden you can't play that role anymore. Do you have a plan in place for what comes next for those whom you love, who are dependent on you, or that you've been providing for? And that could be sitting down with someone in your family and mentoring them about your investing process, so that once you're gone, they're up to speed and can take over the torch on a DIY basis. Or find an advisor. You be DIY for as long as you can, but if nobody in your family has the investing chops and experience that you do, just focus on finding a really good advisor who can take over that responsibility for your family and treat them really well. And if you decide that that's the route that makes sense for you, I would highly recommend finding that advisor as soon as you can, so that you're not going to need him yet, but so that they can meet your family, they can start to build a relationship there. Your spouse is comfortable with them, feels good about them, all that stuff. So when that transition needs to happen, everybody's not just figuring out on the fly when they're in a very emotionally fragile state. It's by that time, hopefully, just plugging into a firm that already knows you and your family really well, and has been waiting to to be there to care for them. So that's my closing point here, Mike. Anything to say on that before I wrap it up?
I guess I'd just say that almost everyone watching this has lost somebody in their life, that they love and the kids. So they already know that money isn't the most important thing. They already know that health and connection is the most important thing. But still getting over that fear is the hardest thing. And so in some ways, a lot of ways, I'm a therapist with experience that can back it up with technical knowledge in the markets and investments. So that's what we have at New Harbor. Let us help you if you want. Let us have a quick chat. We're here for you. That's all I want to say.
All right. Well, thanks, Mike. Okay. Well, folks, if you really enjoyed this whole discussion, especially the interview with Michael Every, and would like to see him come back on soon, let us know by hitting the like button and then clicking on the subscribe button below, as well as that little bell icon right next to it. And if you'd like to take action in your portfolio based upon anything that Michael Every said today, or if you would like to, start to begin to explore putting together a succession plan, so that when you can't manage family finances anymore, you've got a firm that's ready to take over for you. Maybe you'd like to take Mike up on there and his offer to be, co-therapist and co-financial planner. So anyways, to do that, just fill out, to do that, if you've got a good advisor who's already plugged into your life, who can either help you with Michael's Every's ideas or help with a transition plan, great, stick with them. But if you don't have that person, or you want to get a second opinion from a qualified financial advisor who's very well experienced on those topics, then just fill out the very short form at thoughtfulmoney.com. It only takes you a couple seconds to fill out the form. These consultations that you'll have once you fill it out are totally free. There's no commitments involved. You'll get personalized advice from this firm, and you can do whatever you want with that afterwards. Yeah, I just think it's a great thing to do. All right, and so lastly, quick reminder that the Thoughtful Money Fall Online Conference is now open for registration at the lowest early bird price. It's not going to last forever. I want to make sure that everybody who wants to go gets the lowest ticket price they can. So you can go sign up now at thoughtfulmoney.com/conference, and there you'll see our whole faculty. So I don't need to tell you how great it is. You'll see the fantastic luminaries we already have lined up for it there at that site. And then just a quick reminder, if you are a premium subscriber to the Thoughtful Money Substack, then you'll get a code that will give you an additional $50 off that early bird price. And if you're not a subscriber yet, game the system if you like. Just sign up for the newsletter for a month. It's 19 bucks, and you'll save 50 as a result. So you'll be pocketing $31 of profit. I'm totally happy if you do that, because I want the most people as possible to get the lowest price as possible. So if you don't subscribe yet, just go to thoughtfulmoney.com/newsletter. All right, Mike. Thanks, buddy. This was a good one. Markets aren't doing too much that's interesting. It's too interesting right now, which is why we covered, I think, more high level but more important issues this time around. When you and John are back on next week, we'll really dive into the market action. Hopefully, maybe it's doing something a little more interesting by then.
I look forward to it, Adam, and I enjoyed today. Thank you.
All right, buddy. All right, well, we'll see you next week. And everybody else, thanks so much for watching.